Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading true, scary stories from the workplace. I hope you enjoy them. Before I get started, I do want to say that because of the nature of the types of stories that we will be reading today, stories about being in the workplace, some of these stories may include themes of harassment or even SA. So, if you are sensitive to those types of topics, or you are listening with younger children, this may not be the video for you. You may want to skip this one. But for everyone else, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. I worked as an infrastructure manager in the corporate office of a minor retail chain about 14 years ago. The conditions were kind of sucky, so the IT staff were mostly a good group of funny dudes and dudettes who tried to make the most of it and got along great. The software development lead was a pale, pudgy mid to late 30s guy, Philip. Philip had an untreated condition that caused him to compulsively lie constantly and without hesitation. Not little lies, big ones. Straight-faced. No matter what the topic was, he would add in. Sometimes he would bring up subjects to see what he would say. It didn't matter if it was one-on-one or in a car with four bros. He did it. All the time. Since a common drinking thing with friends is asking me to list Philip lies around the fire, I'll just rattle off some for context. A mouse was getting into his cupboards. He taught it to talk by using M&Ms as positive reinforcement. He got his high school marching band signed to a record contract. He can kick 90-yard field goals, but NFL teams passed on him because he has had 3 heart attacks. He was the sole survivor of 2 plane crashes. He once stole a fire truck to put out his neighbor's bonfire because smoke was getting in his house. When he took it back, he parallel parked it, and they were so impressed they offered him a job. He was tired of his computer crashing, so he hacked into Microsoft and fixed their source code. He built a model rocket at science camp and landed it on the moon. He was disqualified from the Moto X Big Air competition at the X Games for getting into a fight. He ripped up his diploma and gave his high school principal a tombstone pile driver off the stage during graduation. He used to do falconry, but with bald eagles. As a kid, he was some sort of Encyclopedia Brown for the FBI/CIA. Multiple #1 hit songs, popular video game premises, and the entire concept and name of MySpace came from a notebook he had stolen from his car. You get the point. It was weird. It was also stuff like, "Sorry, I'm late getting back from lunch. Some guy tried to rob the grocery store, so I jumped across the register and choked him out. They wanted me to stay and talk to the police, but I was worried he would press charges when he woke up." I know this probably doesn't have the impact it should, but it's hard to explain how odd it is to have like a 40-year-old dude in a shirt and tie tell you that when he test drives a car, he takes it to this place where he can do a backflip in it. He only buys cars that survive the backflip. And that's how he ended up with the Hyundai Sonata you're sitting in. It sucks the air out of the room, like when someone is yelling on the subway. Once one of the owners called me and said, "None of you guys were around, so they sent that Philip guy up to help me. Never let that guy anywhere near our effing suite again. He's effed up." No idea what happened, but I heard it had something to do with Babylon 5. Anyway, the other guys would sort of egg him on at times. I honestly didn't. I felt really bad because I would think about if he knew what he was doing when he was doing it, and how that made him feel. Like, "You're doing it again, Philip." Perhaps knowing he might not get away with it this time, or it was one more thing to keep track of in the lexicon. What I was pretty firm about was that no one was going to call him out on it, mostly because I didn't know what he would do. But also because I didn't want to work in an environment where every day was some BS argument, and it wasn't really fair to him. He couldn't help it. I made sure that every new hire knew the rules. I had been there for about 3 years and never had any sort of untoward interactions to him or about him. If anything, I was overly sympathetic of what it must be like. All we truly knew about him was he lived in a mobile home on his family's property, which had a giant fountain from a Vegas casino in it, because he knew a guy who dismantled one and smuggled it to him. And he had married his wife when he was 31 and she was 16, which required parental consent in our state. She had rented an office in an insurance company to convince him she too was in her 30s. Big, weird, eventful jump forward. One day, Philip was sitting in the developer suite, and out of nowhere said, "Hey Ricky, check this out." He had a picture of himself with guns and tactical gear. He said, "I asked for the Cho special. Tomorrow, me, is dead. He's been trying to steal my power. You may want to call in sick." Ricky, thankfully, with everything I effing have in my body, was like, "Cool, man." Then got up, promptly went to legal and reported it. Philip got let out in handcuffs and termed. He obviously wasn't held too long for threats. The police told me to keep my doors locked and my curtains closed until it all blew over. I cleaned the garage out so we could park in it and limit the time exposed outside. It was a tense few months for my then girlfriend and I. It was well known that I used to have to go into work super early to cover for my engineers on Fridays, before anyone else was there. Just me and a big empty parking lot. I remember thinking on every drive over that it was likely my last day on Earth, and how I just hope I don't hear anything first before it happens. When I closed on my first house, I teared up a little bit. People thought I was being sentimental, but I was thinking about how Philip finally doesn't know where to find me. It kind of effed Ricky up, and he soon quit. I once asked him what made him report it, in spite of the normal stream of whatever we were used to, and he said MFer was talking about power, like he was Skeletor or something. Ricky's on my Facebook feed constantly, with very angry / opposing political views as me, and I've never put that dude on snooze once. I'm thankful for anything he has to say. As a weird follow-up, I met the guy's cousin a few years later. The dude told me that Philip and his wife had a weird relationship, like she would buy Philip nothing but toys for Christmas. Not action figures or Funko, etc. The dude telling me this collected action figures and movie props, but like airplanes and dinosaurs and fire trucks and stuff. And he would just sit around on the floor playing with them, making noises. It wasn't a weird sexual thing, just another big red flag flapping in the breeze. I don't have a car, so Uber / Lyft is my main mode of transportation to get to work. This morning, I requested an Uber a half hour before I had to be there, and the pickup was supposed to take less than 5 minutes. But for some reason, my Uber driver kept going in circles. He ended up calling me asking me for directions, and I was telling him exactly where he needed to go, and so was the GPS in the background. At that point, I was irritated, and asked if there was a way that he could cancel because I was going to be late. He said he couldn't, and ended up finding his way to my apartment at the time that I was supposed to be at work. He kept apologizing, and I would mumble, "It's fine, I just need to get there." He ended up taking me to another store that was on the way and asked, "Is this right?" It took all of me not to just blow up. I calmly gave him directions to the actual store I work at, and just told him to please listen to the GPS. We finally get to my job, and I'm nearly 20 minutes late, and as soon as he parked, I muttered thanks, got out, and bolted to the office to clock in. An hour or so into my shift, one of my managers came up to me to tell me that the Uber driver has been harassing the people in the front of the store, trying to get a hold of me / my manager to take fault for me being late / apologize to me. You need a membership to shop there, so he kept getting kicked out. He tried 4 to 5 separate times to come in. Another hour goes by, and a different manager approached me to let me know that the Uber driver has resorted to blowing up the store's phone, begging to speak to me. She had asked me not to leave alone and be on the lookout in case he came back. I contacted Uber support multiple times to let them know. And you want to know what they did about it? They gave me a $3 credit. I made sure to give him a 1-star review, so I wouldn't get him as a driver again. But it's just scary to think that he knows where I work and live. Against the advice of my parents, I started working at a bikini coffee stand when I was 17 years old and continued working there until I was 20. If you're unfamiliar with bikini coffee stands, they're little drive-through espresso stands, usually painted in some neon color, where the employees all wear lingerie or bikinis while they serve coffee. I know this sounds strange, and believe me, it is strange. However, the money was good, it was fun at the time, and my parents couldn't really afford to pay for college. There is no loudspeaker where customers place their order. They simply drive up to the stand, order coffee, and make small talk as they ogle you and your skimpy ensemble. Anyway, it's kind of hard to explain, so maybe just Google it. The Seattle area has them all over the place. Within a matter of months, the boss gave me the busiest shift. The shift began at 4 a.m. and ended at 9:30 a.m. Though the coffee stand was not officially open until 4:30, I had to count the till, grind the espresso beans, fill up the sinks, take stock, clean if needed, etc. The coffee stand was situated in the corner of a large parking lot, sharing the enormous empty lot with only one other retailer. The other retailer didn't open until around 10 a.m., and so when I arrived, the lot was completely dark, save for one dim street lamp above the stand, and another in the far corner of the lot. I pulled up to the stand as I normally did, only this time it was my first shift alone. Normally I worked with one other girl, as the shift would get far too busy for just one person. I had a routine with regular customers, as I literally worked every single day. The boss didn't believe in time off unless requested. While I worked, I could see cars approach the stand, and know immediately what drink to prepare, based on my recognizing a regular customer's vehicle. After almost a year on the morning shift, it was rare to see a new vehicle, or meet a new customer. My boss was extremely strict about being fast and efficient, and would have us prepare drinks in advance for our regulars while they waited in the line of cars. My boss was so strict that for the first 6 months of my working there, he would watch constantly on his camera system and call me on the business phone to scream at me for my lack of efficiency. After this, I became so fast at preparing drinks, I guess he decided he would save money by having me work alone in the very early morning hours. He was stingy too. So, like normal, I approached the stand and punched in the access code. I went inside and turned on some music right away to keep myself company. The street lamp directly above the coffee stand had burnt out a few days before, so it was rather dark outside, coupled with the tinted sliding windows of the coffee stand, and the knowledge that I was completely alone. I felt a little creeped out, though not nearly as creeped out and terrified as I was about to feel in a few minutes. Even though the stand was technically open at 4:30, I wouldn't expect my first customer until about 4:45. I usually arrived at 4 o'clock, but since it was my first shift alone, I came in at 3:30 to give myself enough time to complete all the opening tasks. My first customer was always Dave. He drove a red sports car and ordered a double cappuccino, heavy on the foam. He worked for the local Boeing plant, and would brag about his high-ranking job in between awkward remarks about my body. You get used to this sort of thing after a while, but nothing could prepare me for the sort of thing that happened to me on this particular dark morning. Though many of our customers were pervy men like Dave, most of the early morning customers weren't as lecherous as one would expect. They simply needed coffee, and no other business was open as early as ours. In fact, many of my early morning customers were married women in soccer mom vans, in desperate need of caffeine. I glanced up at the clock as I counted the money in the till. 3:50 a.m. I finished the count and walked from the back of the stand onto the main floor. There were 2 steps separating the back of the stand from the main floor. The back of the stand had no windows and contained a bathroom, large refrigerator, washer, dryer, etc. This is the area where my coworkers and myself would get ready and joke around where customers couldn't see us. As soon as we walked onto the main floor where customers could see us, uniform was required, meaning lingerie or bikini, as well as heels. That morning I was wearing a matching pink lingerie set with knit stockings. The lingerie fully covered my breasts and buttocks, and provided more coverage than a typical bikini that you would see at the beach. I counted all of the syrup bottles. I opened the fridge and took stock inside. I turned on the espresso grinder and robotically poured in a bag of espresso beans. I started filling up the large commercial sink with the soapy water. Music played softly on the stereo. Then I heard it. Over the noise of the faucet, coffee grinder, and the music. I wasn't sure I heard anything at first, so I just ignored it. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was tapping on the sliding glass window of the stand. I wiped off my wet hands and grabbed my cell phone. 4:15 a.m. We weren't open for another 15 minutes. I checked the light switches to make sure I didn't accidentally flip on the open sign. Along with an open sign, the stand was equipped with bright floodlights to illuminate the presence of the stand. Due to the sheer darkness that morning, I had contemplated turning on the lights when I first started, but it was strictly forbidden to do so until the stand was open. Without the floodlights on and through the tinted glass, I could not see who was on the other side. I stood there, staring at the window. Maybe it's just Dave, I rationalized to myself. Tap, tap, tap. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. The tapping had definitely grown louder. I picked up the business phone and punched in my boss's number. He had an extensive camera system, complete with night vision, and could see in real time both inside and outside of the stand. In the very least, he could tell me who was outside. The phone rang and rang. No answer. I flipped on the floodlights. I walked over to the window and saw the man, now illuminated by the bright lights. His head was pressed up against the glass, hands cupped around his eyes as he tried to see in. I jumped back. "Hi," he yelled through the glass. "Can I get some coffee?" "We aren't open for another 15 minutes, I replied. "My boss will be mad if I open early." "Oh, well, I can wait." The man then walked away from the window and stepped into a small black Honda. I continued my opening duties, warily eyeing the black Honda. At the time, I felt a false sense of security. I lulled into the daily routine of my shift. However, this was different. At 4:30, I dutifully turned on the open sign and watched as the man in the black Honda drove up to the window. He was wearing a dark red baseball cap, a thermal shirt, and plaid pajama pants. I opened the sliding window. "Hi, sorry about that. What can I get for you this morning?" I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. The man looked at me for what felt like an eternity. "What I want doesn't appear to be on the menu," he said, not looking up from my crotch. "Okay, so I know what you're thinking. What did I expect working in this profession? Gentlemen?" I brushed his comment aside with a laugh. "We have a great white chocolate mocha." I looked around frantically. Where the F was the usual morning guy, Dave? I silently prayed for another customer to pull up behind this guy. He looked away and stared at his steering wheel. "I want you to be my maid." "Excuse me," I said, not sure if I heard him correctly. "I want you to be my maid. I want you to come over to my house wearing a maid costume with nothing underneath. I want to watch you. And if you don't clean correctly, I'm going to do whatever I want to you." He paused and gripped his steering wheel tightly. "I am not a nice guy." He looked up at me and smiled. Until that point in my life, I had never seen a truly sinister smile before. I slammed the long serving window shut. I ran to the back of the stand, hyperventilating at this point. I picked up the phone and called my boss repeatedly. No answer. I stood on the steps and peered out the window. The black Honda was gone, replaced by the familiar red of Dave's sports car. I never thought I would be happy to see pervy Dave, but here I was, rushing to the serving window to tell him what had happened. I opened the window, all the while frantically relaying the story. Dave just laughed and muttered something about the guy dreaming. He told me I was being paranoid and the guy just had no filter. For some reason, this put me at ease. Dave reached his hand out the window to place a $5 bill into my tip jar. He tipped this amount each morning. "Wow," he exclaimed. "You just opened and your tip jar is already full. I know you make good coffee, but it's not that great." "Huh?" I said, slamming the register shut. The tip jar rested on the outside window ledge, so customers could reach it. I made it a habit of just leaving it outside in between customers, as it could get very busy. I leaned over and looked into the metal canister. Inside the tip jar was a long white envelope, that appeared to be stuffed to its capacity. My stomach turned, as I knew it had to be from the guy in the black Honda. "Dave," I said cautiously, "it's from that guy I just told you about." "I'm not opening that." Dave sipped his cappuccino, and suddenly his goofy demeanor turned serious. "You're right. Let me open it. I have gloves." It was late fall and rather cold out. Dave put on his gloves in a dramatic manner, laughing about my paranoia, and proceeded to step outside of his car. He took the envelope out of my tip jar and opened it. "Holy crap," he said, his eyes widening. He held up a stack of $20 bills held together by a rubber band. On the back of the stack was a folded up piece of paper. He unfolded the paper and began reading it. His eyes grew even wider. His hands were shaking ever so slightly. "What? What does it say?" He simply said, "Get dressed and call the police." I snatched the note from him, his jaw slightly agape. The note was laden with spelling errors and looked as if it was written in a child's hand. Oddly, there were rather long words that were attempted but spelled incorrectly. It said some very deranged things. There were some things too sick to mention here, but I will relay the basic message as best as I can recall. Some things you just never forget, even if you want to. So here it is, without the spelling errors and the length. It was 2 pages long, front and back. "You will come to my house. When you arrive, I will examine you thoroughly. I will then tie you to the post, and you will be punished for what you do. Every inch of your body will be bruised and sore. Afterward, I will untie you and use you in every way possible." He used a different term, but it's extremely graphic and includes the words hogtied. "You can scream, but no one will hear you. This is your first payment. Upon reading this note and taking this money, you have agreed to follow through. If you do not follow through, you are stealing, lying, and you will be punished more severely than if you cooperated to this initial agreement. You will clean every inch of my house. There will be no mistakes, or there will be more punishment to follow." I got dressed and called the police and my boss, who finally answered. The police arrived and I went to the station to explain in detail what happened. I handed them the note, along with the money for evidence. The female police officer, who appeared to be in charge, nonchalantly told me that I should probably quit my job, that this behavior was to be expected from customers. I told her that I had never experienced anything like this before. My boss reviewed the outside videotape. The footage showed a man standing outside of the coffee stand window just staring inside. Occasionally, it showed him leaning his head into the glass and cupping his hands around his eyes for a better view. It also showed him rubbing his crotch. Apparently, he had been standing outside the window since 3:40 a.m. 10 minutes later, after the initial arrival, at one point it showed him going back into his car, only to re-emerge several minutes later and finally tap on the window. I was shocked to realize that the man had watched me for almost a full hour without my knowledge. I felt stupid, but most of all scared. The footage also revealed that the man had his license plate covered with what appeared to be white paper. After reviewing the footage and the note, the police decided that the man posed a potential threat, and that this behavior was not normal. Duh. They sent an undercover cop back to the stand with me. I was shocked that they wanted me to go right back to work not even 2 hours after the incident. The cop sat outside in an SUV while I worked. The plan was this. If the man drove through again, I was to flick the open sign on and off to alert him of the man's presence. I worked, serving all of my regular customers, trying my best to pretend nothing happened. I was told not to recall the incident to any of my coworkers or customers that morning, in case they knew the man, and warned him of police involvement. The man did not return that day, but he did return. Little did I know, that day was only the beginning of a year-long nightmare. Edit. To all of those who asked, this happened well over 6 years ago. Final update and conclusion. I have been inundated with messages for a part 2. Unfortunately, I'm unable to post the rest of the story on Let's Not Meet, because series posts are no longer allowed. I posted part 2 on No Sleep, but unfortunately the guidelines do not allow users to continue stories on Let's Not Meet over at No Sleep. I'm sure you can find part 2 in a paste bin somewhere, but I'll keep it simple and relay a short version of the conclusion. I fully intend to complete this series. Unfortunately, I no longer wish to invest the time nor the energy to keep posting the rest of the story, only to have it removed by moderators, which I understand rules are rules. So I will end this story with letting you all know that I'm fine now. I'll give you a quick synopsis of how things turned out. The stalking continued for a while, about a year. The stalker left endless creepy gifts for me, both at work and at my place of residence, all of which he signed off on as Turner. It got to a point where I couldn't prove it was him, because it would often be sent by courier or a third party. He continued to come by the stand, and at one point even promised to leave me alone. My coworker was there, and we actually managed to have a very brief discussion in which he apologized and agreed that this behavior was inappropriate. However, he resumed his creepy behavior just days later. The police were of no help, and kept insisting to me that it would all go away if I just quit my job. I had his license plate, which was out of state, and vehicle description, but apparently the car wasn't even registered. I didn't even know that this was a possibility. Despite taking a leave of absence, the stalking continued. I didn't want to quit my job, as this was shortly after the recession. My mom, the sole provider for a family of 5, had lost her job, so I wanted to chip in and help her so that they wouldn't lose the house. Other bikini stands in the area were not hiring, due to being embroiled in prostitution scandals, all of which were heavily covered by the national media. You have no idea how hard it was, and maybe still is, to get a normal job after having worked as a bikini barista. Employers don't like it on your job history too much. A few of the scariest incidences were being assaulted in an ice freezer outside of the coffee stand. Thankfully, he didn't harm me physically, just grabbed me and touched me inappropriately. Turner coming through the drive-thru completely naked and enjoying himself into a pair of women's underwear. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say all this here, but I have previously omitted this from my story due to explicit SA nature. If this is in violation of the guidelines, please let me know before removing my post. I will remove it. Another incident occurred when my friend gave me a joint a customer had left for me on her shift. Crazy as it may sound, my regulars fairly often would leave joints in my tip jar instead of money. I liked to smoke a lot at the time. I asked my coworker for the customer's name, but she didn't get a chance to ask for it. I was told by my friend/coworker that he had long hair and looked like a hippie. This fit the description of a customer who would regularly leave joints in my tip jar. I smoked the joint before I went to sleep one night, only to have a massive freakout, full of hallucinations, hysteria, etc. I literally thought I saw ghosts, demons, and fire. I ended up in the hospital. I found out in the hospital that in addition to having marijuana in my system, I also had a bunch of PCP in my system as well. Later on, Turner would take credit for this joint by sending a text to my phone, letting me know that if I wanted to smoke me out, that we could get another sometime. I guess he thought that this weed was enjoyable. Of course, I gave his number to the police. I feel like I gave them enough information to get this guy, but I was just never taken seriously, or they had bigger fish to fry. They did find out, however, that the phone was used as a burner. Again, I did not plan on and did not previously include this in my story. Just typing this out is giving me horrible flashbacks to that time on PCP. I do my best to never think about this or bring it up. In this period of time, it was evident that one of my coworkers was sharing my personal information with Turner in exchange for money, or maybe because she just didn't like me. This coworker was later arrested on prostitution charges. I ended up relocating and changing my last name, which is surprisingly easy to do. I did this primarily to get away from Turner, but also so I could just get a fresh start with a new employment history and get away from the negative energy that had encircled my life. I had taken photos of myself for my boyfriend at the time, and after we broke up, he leaked them to everyone on my contact list, including my coworkers, of course. This meant Turner most likely got a hold of the photos as well. It may seem strange to you, but after a while, the stalking becomes part of your life. It's kind of like living around a bunch of rattlesnakes. You may feel constantly on guard and on edge, but eventually, you work your daily routine around trying your best to avoid the snakes so you won't get bitten. When it happens, you do your best to move on. I have recently found out, within the last few months, that a man fitting my stalker's description was incarcerated some time ago for doing something even more frightening to another barista in the Pacific Northwest. There were also similar incidences and reports of a man driving through bikini stands naked, or with women's underwear. I suspect that this man was most likely Turner. I cannot be sure it is the same person, as I never was able to find out this person's true first and last name, but I am hopeful that it is him. and he will be locked away for a very long time. I work at a large crafting store in California, and have been there for a year and 8 months now. A little background is needed before I explain what is going on. So last year we hired a guy that we'll name Hayden. Hayden was a little quiet on the first day, but quickly became more talkative, and over the next couple of weeks started to never stop talking. He would constantly say weird stuff. For instance, one day he was put in charge of building furniture. Our store carries stuff like furniture and home decor as well. He was apparently having difficulty assembling the table that he was working on, and said something about cutting his wrists if he can't figure out how to put it together. Another time, we were both working in the stock room, and he kept talking about how much he liked the Parkland shooter, Nicholas Cruz. I'll admit, he did in fact look like that kid, which was creepy. I remember, one day I'd gotten off of work, and was waiting for my ride to pick me up, when out of nowhere Hayden walked up behind me. He just stood there with an awkward smile on his face, and I politely asked him what's up. He said something to the effect of, "Oh, nothing much, just enjoying my lunch break. I'm thinking about going inside Taco Bell, right across the parking lot from our work, and shanking someone." He pretty much laughed and said he was joking after saying that. When my wife picked me up, we saw him walking towards the Taco Bell, and just flashed us this creepy ear-to-ear smile. So the last straw for me was when he and I were assigned to work our spring freight and get it loaded up on a large U-boat. Our shift started at 7 a.m. and was over at noon. It was 11, and we still hadn't finished our task because Hayden just wouldn't stop goofing around. He would also work very slowly on purpose and would only take one item to the U-boat at once. Our boss came to where we were working and was upset that we weren't done yet. He told us we would both get written up if the job wasn't finished before we were off. I was pissed off at this point and Hayden knew it. He seemed to feel bad for pretty much getting me in trouble and apologized. He then said something that really concerned me. He said in the most serious tone I had ever heard him speak in since meeting him, "If I get fired, I'll shoot this place up." He went on to say that he knew where all the emergency exits are and would first shoot all the cashiers and then move on to the other employees in the store. I'll admit that I didn't immediately report what he said, but it did have me on edge, and I kept thinking about what if. After some convincing from my wife, I finally did the right thing and informed my manager. They took a written report from me and contacted the police. After 2 more days of working with Hayden, he was fired and subsequently arrested for his threats. The week after he got arrested, my boss held a meeting with the entire staff and told everyone what had happened. After everyone left the meeting, he pulled me aside and revealed to me what the police and Hayden talked about during the interrogation. I don't completely remember what was said, but Hayden apparently admitted that he said what he said and kept asking if I had been the one who reported him. Fast forward to a few weeks ago, I was working at the same store, still am, and was heading to the break room for my final break when I heard a voice from one of the aisles to the left. A man was standing next to the paint case and asked if I could get him some paint. While I was opening the case, he addressed me by name, which I immediately thought was weird because I wasn't wearing my name tag on this particular day. Out of curiosity, I asked him how he knew my name, and he said it was just a lucky guess, to which I thought was BS, mainly because his tone of voice seemed sarcastic. The entire time I was getting his paint, he was staring at me with a smirk on his face. He then began to ask me questions about my name, which is the same name of a popular TV show character. He asked what year I was born, why my parents decided to give me that name, etc. At this point, I started to walk away, as I had other things to do, and the whole time I was walking away, he was still trying to talk to me. I heard him yelling my name from 3 aisles down. I went and stood in the warehouse until I thought he was gone. Later that same day, one of my coworkers asked me if I knew the guy who was buying the paint, and I told her I didn't. She told me that he had approached her and asked her all kinds of questions about me, like if I'm a good worker and if she likes me as a coworker. This is an ongoing issue too, as he's come into the store 2 other times, one being yesterday during my day off, and apparently asked where I was. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that this guy might be cousins with Hayden, as they sort of look alike and have similar mannerisms. Both look similar to the Parkland shooter and have that same creepy vibe. This might not be the scariest thing on here, but it's still freaky. I'll update if something else happens. Hey guys, so I didn't expect the responses I've gotten, but thank you so much for the advice. I am safe and have reported this matter to my manager, who is thankfully taking this very seriously. I have not seen my potential stalker, and am hoping to never see him again. Update. Tonight, I worked the closing shift and was outside getting carts after the store closed at 8 p.m. when 2 SUVs pulled into the parking lot. One of them parked behind the store, and the other one parked in the main parking lot. I was standing in front of the entrance doors when a man dressed in all black and wearing a hood stepped out of one of the SUVs. Another guy walked up next to him, and they both started approaching the store. I politely told them we were closed, and when I looked back down, I noticed a large baseball bat in hoodie guy's hand. I started repeatedly ringing the bell to be let back inside, and these 2 guys were just pacing back and forth in the lot staring right at me. My manager let me in and called the police. The guys were long gone when they got there. This could have easily been a totally unrelated incident, but I thought I'd still update because the whole thing makes me think it could be you know who. My encounters with John started last summer while I was at work. I work in an apartment complex with a few other ladies, so we regularly interact with hundreds of residents and even more strangers, especially during the summer, when people are coming in to tour and sign leases. On Monday mornings during the busy season, I usually come into a stack of pending applications. As the property manager, I have to review the results of each background check, as well as every applicant's proof of income, to determine if they can be approved to live in the complex based on our requirements. Monday, May 6th was just like any other. I reviewed the applications from over the weekend. Some were approved and some were not. I then called the applicants to let them know the status of their applications. One of the declined applicants, John, was particularly sketchy looking. His credit score was particularly low. He had no obvious sources of income, and a lot of his payment history consisted of late payments. The biggest red flag, however, was a collection for a landlord for over $6,000. This immediately indicated to me that he skipped out of his previous apartment and/or completely trashed the place. Like everyone else, I called him to tell him why he was declined and to explain that we would be sending him an adverse action letter. Once I was on the phone with John, he initially said I must be wrong about the collection account. I gave him the name of the complex. He then tried to explain the perfectly reasonable explanation for why he must have the collection account. According to his story, he had been living with his girlfriend. They broke up partway through their lease and decided to both move out as a result. On the day they left, they went to their apartment complex leasing office and paid the remainder of the lease in cash to a woman they had supposedly never seen before. She must have stolen my money, he said. You can't hold this against me. Though I seriously doubted the validity of his story, I apologized and told him that I couldn't approve anyone that didn't meet our leasing requirements. Then I ended the call. Later that day, he called back and told one of my leasing agents, Brandy, that he'd contacted the collection agency and paid off the balance in full. Now you'll approve me, right? She asked him to forward the proof of this to our office and told him, the manager will have a look at it and decide if you can be approved now. Sure enough, the letter from the collection agency came in later that day. He called back again, and she told him again that the manager would have to look at it, and then let him know. Meanwhile, I was trying to decide if I could approve him. Technically, he still had a collection account on his record, even if the balance was $0, and didn't meet some of the other rent requirements. Thankfully, before I had to make a decision, someone else with a great credit and a solid source of income came in and rented our last one-bedroom apartment. The apartments are first come, first serve, so we called John back and told him that we unfortunately no longer had any one-bedroom apartments left. Fast forward to late July 2019. I'm at work with our newest leasing agent, Sarah, one afternoon preparing for turns. A young man with sallow skin comes in, and immediately I recognized him, but I wasn't sure from where. I was fairly certain he wasn't a resident. I recognized most of the people that live at my complex, but maybe he was a friend of a resident or someone that had toured recently. He explained that his name was John and that he'd applied for an apartment earlier in the summer. It suddenly hit me where I knew the guy from. Back in May, he, a complete stranger, had tried to get in my car with me. At the time, I had warned my coworkers of the event, even suggested there was a small chance he might come in over the weekend and to be careful. even though he'd told me he was only in town that one day. Immediately, I was uncomfortable. He looked super angry. He pointed to my desk and asked, "Where's the lady that normally sits here? Where is the manager?" My desk is just that, my desk. But on the weekends when it's Brandy working, she often sits at my desk because my computer is the only one with functioning speakers. Likewise, Brandy is much older, late 50s, and people very regularly assume she's the manager since she is so much older. "Oh, you must mean Brandy," I said, forcing myself to seem cheerful. "She's not working today." "When will she be in next? I have a bone to pick with that effing B word." Of course, I lied to him. "Oh, she's out sick. I have no idea when she'll be well enough to come back to work." "She's at home then?" he asked. "Where does she live?" I laughed like he was joking and told him that I can't give out any of my employees' personal information. He then proceeded to fill us in, telling us that Brandy had screwed him out of an apartment by not letting him know fast enough if paying off the collection account meant that he could rent an apartment. Clearly, Brandy was conspiring against him because she rented the apartment to someone else when she knew he needed that apartment. Now he was homeless because of her. She was clearly the worst manager in the entire world, and someone needed to teach her a lesson. And not only was he homeless now, he was out $6,000 because obviously he wouldn't have paid that balance off if he knew he'd lose the apartment regardless. Sarah and I were very attentive the entire time, frowning slightly and nodding our heads, sympathetically as he went on his long, hateful rant. Clearly he was mistaken about Brandy being the manager. His rage really should have been directed at me, if anyone, but I wasn't going to point that out to him at this point. In an attempt to curb his anger, I told him there was no way Brandy or any of us would have been acting maliciously in renting the last one-bedroom apartment to someone else. The apartments are, again, first come, first serve, and we're just doing our jobs by renting the apartments out. I then told him we still had a two-bedroom apartment available for rent if he was interested in that unit. I had no intentions of renting any apartments to him at this point, and I was pretty certain he couldn't afford the two-bedroom. It was twice as expensive as the one-bedroom. But my hope was that it would calm him down long enough for him to leave, because I was showing an effort to accommodate him. At that point, he told me no. He wasn't interested in a more expensive apartment. That frankly, our complex seemed pretty crappy, and he wouldn't want to live there anyway. He then proceeded to ask us a bunch of other questions. Is this a family-owned business? Are you two sisters? How old are you? Are you related to Brandy? Does anyone know you're here right now? If something happened to you, would it hurt Brandy? A feeling of dread washed over me. No one asks those kinds of questions. No normal, sane person at least. Worse, he was standing in the doorway, blocking our only exit. I looked at Sarah across the room and knew she expected me to know what to do. I'm gonna have to kill this guy, I realized. Up to this point, I was hoping that being nice and understanding would be enough to get him to leave. In my line of work, you deal with a lot of weirdos. My husband always gets so mad when I tell him about the weird, creepy, gross encounters I have with residents and strangers, and he always asks why I tolerate it. Just kick people out, he tells me. Tell them you'll call the cops. The problem is that a lot of the weirdos are harmless, and frankly, it's easier to deal with them by being nice than mean. If I tried to kick out every resident who was a jerk to me, the apartments would be empty, and we'd be collecting no rent. And if I lost my cool every time someone was weird, every time I'd have to deal with that person going forward would be an awkward and difficult, because they'd had one bad experience with me. Also, you just never know when my escalating the situation will lead to the other person also escalating further, damaging property or harming someone. But in this case, John was clearly escalating regardless of what I said and did. I looked at my purse on the floor. Both my phone and gun were in it. It seemed so out of reach. Surely John would notice me grabbing my bag and awkwardly digging around in it. The gun was in a holster in a hidden pocket of the bag. I didn't know if he had a weapon on him. If he realized I was getting my weapon, he might attack me outright, trying to appear still to him. I reached out my leg, trying to quietly drag my bag closer to me. He screamed something about getting effed over all the time by effing B words. And I finally snapped at him. You're making me uncomfortable now and I need you to leave. He tried to say something else and I screamed again to leave. I grabbed my bag, hoping I'd be able to get the gun out fast enough. I don't know if he saw where things were heading or if he just thought I was going to call the police, but he got up and ran out of the office. Sarah and I immediately locked up the office and left. As we were leaving, Sarah told me how crazy the whole thing was. She'd be wishing for something exciting to happen ever since she'd been hired. And I remember telling her I had thought I was going to have to kill the guy to protect us. With what? The stapler? She didn't know about my gun. Yeah, with the stapler. Thankfully, John never came back in. It's been over a year now, so I think it's pretty safe to assume he's moved on and won't be back. I'm super glad I didn't have to kill him. If he hadn't left when he did, I'm pretty sure it would have gotten to that point, based on his veiled threats and previous behavior. I really hope that day never comes. Several years ago, I worked at a crisis unit for the acutely mental ill. It was a 10-bed unit where individuals would come to stay as a step down from a psychiatric hospitalization or a diversion to prevent psychiatric hospitalization. I often worked alone on the weekends. One Friday evening, we received an admission, Michael. Background info was provided with the referral, indicating a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and recent release from prison after serving a sentence for murder. I completed the initial intake meeting with Michael, during which time he said some sexually explicit things to me. I made it clear that this was inappropriate, and that confidentiality was limited in that the staff working on the unit, as part of his treatment team, would be privy to anything said in the interview or subsequent one on one of the sessions. He responded well to the redirection. We finished the intake, and I went about the rest of my shift until about 11 p.m. that night, when he approached the office and asked if I was working alone. Luckily, at the time, I wasn't alone, and I told him that my male coworker was in the adjoining office. After this encounter, I explained the situation to my coworker, who read my shift summary, and decided to sit down with Michael and tell him the way he was acting was not acceptable, and he could risk being released from the program if it continued. The next morning, I was working alone from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Around 9 a.m., I went to wake up another client, Jeremy, to administer his medications. The room Jeremy was assigned was at the end of the hallway, and he was usually slow to get up in the mornings. While I was knocking on Jeremy's door, Michael approached me to tell me he didn't appreciate that I shared the things he said to me to my male coworker. I explained to Michael that he knew what he said was inappropriate, and that he knew anything he said to me would be shared with the rest of the treatment team. Michael became more agitated and got in my face, backing me into the corner in front of Jeremy's bedroom door. At this point, Jeremy had woken up and heard what was happening outside his room. Jeremy came out of his room, stood between Michael and myself, and told Michael that he needed to walk away and cool down. Michael went back to his room, and I contacted my supervisor, who told me to document the encounter and continue my shift. Needless to say, I left the job shortly after this incident. I am thankful for Jeremy, in that he had the presence of mind, while also being a client with a mental illness, to intervene on my behalf. I often wonder what would have happened if Jeremy wouldn't have woken up, or if he would have been in a more severe state of mental illness and would have become agitated as well. Edit. For those saying I couldn't possibly have worked by myself on a 10-bed unit, it was not a secure unit. It was a voluntary unit and was never intended for violent individuals. Michael should have never been there. He needed a higher level of care than we could provide. But to get funding, we need beds filled. I was a bachelor's level mental health worker. I administered medications, facilitated psychoeducational groups, and completed one-on-one sessions with clients every shift. I shouldn't have had to work alone, but I did. I don't know if it was legal. I'm assuming it is in my state, but I have no idea. Protocol was to call 911 if things ever got out of hand, and if they were really bad, to petition for involuntary hospitalization of the individual. Weekdays, there were 2 staff and a supervisor present. Evenings, there were sometimes 2 staff, depending on the day of the week. Overnight, there was 1 staff, and on the weekends, it was me by myself until the cook or cleaning person came for roughly a half hour each. It wasn't an ideal situation, but it is common in residential homes for individuals with intellectual disabilities, some personal care homes, etc., where I am from. I'm an 18-year-old female, and just started a job at a hotel a little over a month ago as a housekeeper. The hotel is located in very rural Midwest. Not a super busy hotel except for the occasional family reunions checking in and a few workers passing through the state. Many of the people who come through are older, 40s, 50s, and upwards. When I first started, my parents had told me to be careful because the hotel was sketchy. I never really found it to be sketchy or the people passing through to be, until one day about 2 weeks ago. I had just clocked in around 10:30 and headed down to the end of the hall opposite of where the lobby was to start on my stayovers, rooms where people stayed more than one night. At the end of the hall, there were 4 rooms tucked into almost a corner, I want to say. You can't really see the doors to these rooms until you reach the end of the hallway. There's 2 rooms on one side, 2 on the other. I was grabbing all of the supplies that I needed to do the stayover when a man, another stayover, came out of one of the 4 rooms and asked how to work the coffee machine. He was about 3 times the size of me, 6'3", around 300 pounds, whereas I am 5'3" and about 125. Didn't seem like a big deal or weird. I'm pretty friendly and outgoing and can make small talk. I went back to cleaning the other room and minding my business when he comes out again to tell me his room didn't need attended to. I figured so and was glad that was another room I could check off my list. My manager had come down the hall to strip a room that had checked out, and I turned down the hall to go strip another room when the man came out of his room again. I assumed he had another question about something in the room, so I turned around to speak to him. He asked, "Aren't you scared to do your job?" And I replied, "No, not really, since I rarely ever have any interaction with guests as a housekeeper." He then went on to say that I was awfully pretty, and I needed a mace, or a weapon to protect myself. And I showed him my car keys that I kept in my pocket for that exact reason. The conversation at first wasn't really off-putting, but then I realized what he was getting at, my body flooded with anxiety. He then said, "I don't think your car keys are enough. You're small and could easily get snatched up." And in that moment, I went into the room my manager was in across the hall and waited for him to go back into his room before continuing my job as normal as possible. That experience really shook me up, and I sat in another room down the hall for about an hour crying and having anxiety attacks because I thought this man would try to find me in whatever room I was in and kidnap me. So this happened yesterday. I work at a shoe store as a part-time job so that I can afford my studies. Basically, I help people trying to find the size they want, advise them, because we also have sports shoes and hiking boots. Have to put shoe boxes in the shelf when we get new articles, that kind of stuff. We have 3 alleys to which we are assigned for the day, men, women, and kids. Yesterday I was assigned to the kids alley, which is the alley I kind of like the least, because, well, kids have a tendency of throwing tantrums because they don't like the shoe their mom wants to get for them, or simply because they're kids, you know. You also have to know that there is some kind of small kid-friendly zone in that area of the store, where there's a little TV screen, cartoons, and some chairs. It's really common in my country for big stores to have that kind of thing. This woman enters with her daughter, and when they go to my alley, I greet them and ask how I can help them. They tell me they're just taking a look, so I go back to my other occupants. At the same time, some guy walks in, probably in his mid-30s, and he gives off a weird vibe, but I don't really pay attention to him. He was not the first weirdo to enter the store, you know. The mother and daughter keep looking around. The mother asks which kind of shoes her daughter wants. Pretty normal stuff. I see the weird guy giving looks in our direction, but for the moment he stays in the men's area of the store, which is near, so I don't really see the problem. After a while, the mother needs to go to the bathroom. She asks me how to get there and I tell her, and she asks me to keep an eye on her daughter while she was away, which was no problem with me. I went to the daughter and asked her if she wanted to watch some cartoons while waiting for her mom, and she agreed, so she sat in front of the TV and calmly watched cartoons. My boss comes in and gives me some articles to put on the shelves, so I tell the daughter not to move and that I am right here if she needs anything. I then go to the other side of the area to put the shoes on the shelf, and after a few minutes I hear a scream. I immediately went back to the TV, and guess who was trying to take the little girl with him? Yeah, weirdo guy. He was just waiting for an opportunity, apparently. I asked the guy why he is talking to this little girl, and he tries to lie, telling me that she is his daughter. I had heard the mother saying the daughter's name before, so I asked the guy what's her name. Says it's Emily. It wasn't. I asked him to go away from the store or I will call security. When he heard that, he was gone like the wind. The mother comes back and I explain to her what happened. She thanks me. Apparently the little girl screamed because her mother taught her that when a stranger approached her, that was the thing to do. I'm really glad that she did that, because it made it so that he didn't have the time to enter in physical contact with her, as the scream made me arrive quickly. If she hadn't done that, he might have been able to take her. Edit. Okay, so after seeing the comments, I wanted to clarify a few things. First, police has been called. My boss had known about the incident, and I wasn't sure if he already called them, but I contacted him and the police are now investigating camera footage. I would have been useless to call security because he ran away very quickly, and by the time they would have gotten there, he probably would have been gone. My priority was to get him away from the girl, but that doesn't mean this should go unpunished. I told the mom that we were counting on finding the guy, and told her to keep in touch with my boss once he retrieved the camera footage and gave it to the police. People also seemed very shocked that the mother would leave her daughter alone in a store, simply being watched by an employee who has other stuff to do. It doesn't happen a lot in our store, as I said in the comments, but since we live in a very calm town and that the parents are usually gone for less than 5 minutes, I feel like it was not a big deal. I had told the mom that I probably would have other occupations and that I could not have eyes on her daughter at all times, but that there was no problem in me just being sure that the little girl is still just watching cartoons and not destroying the store. As I said, very calm city, and the mall in which the store is in is one of the most safest neighborhoods of this calm city. So even when I said that she was not really worried, it was not a busy day, and we could really not have predicted what happened, and we were pretty positive that in the 5-minute span where the mother was gone, nothing major would happen. Sadly, that was not the case. I have once refused to keep an eye on a child when I knew it was going to be rush hour and that I would not have time to check on the kids. So yeah, just to reassure you guys, we do not accept to be babysitters while we're supposed to be doing something else. This story has made me think about all this, and accepting to do this in the future. But you have to realize that what happened does not represent the usual safeness of the place. But it does raise the question of what should you do when you know that even if they're unlikely to, these kind of things might happen. This happened a good few years ago. Some context. I was in my early 20s, single and living by myself. Most of my family lived about a 4-hour drive away from me. I was working for a small call center that provided, among other things, phone services for a 24-hour plumbing company, so they needed someone to be on the line at all times. My shift ran from 8 p.m. to whenever my boss showed up to pick up the line, which was usually 6 a.m. I worked in a building that housed several businesses of the same sort. Call center work mostly, though we were the only one that had 24-hour services. Because of budget cuts, I was the only operator on my floor. The only people in the building that night were myself and the security guy who came by to do his rounds twice a night. Now, because the line had to be on 24/7, I was never allowed to disconnect while I was there. I ran to and from the bathroom, ate meals sitting in front of the computer, and every once in a while sneaked a cigarette at the window within sight of the screen. Only the light above my computer was on. Everything else was turned off. When everyone went away around 10 p.m., so I was left in this half-darkness beneath a spotlight. I desperately needed that job to support myself, so despite the crap conditions, I kept repeating that it wasn't that bad. Things were usually quiet after 10 p.m. I could use the extra hours on my paycheck, and didn't need to get a second job. I did a lot of reading, and even considered going back to school because, if nothing else, the night shift would afford me plenty of time to study. So one night, around 2 a.m. or so, I got a call. I introduced myself as I always did. "Hello, you're calling so-and-so. My name is Jill, how may I help you?" The guy on the other side repeated my name and hung up. Working phone services on the night shift, you get used to a lot of weird stuff, so I shrugged it off and went back to my book. Then he called again and asked if he was speaking to Jill. I said yes, repeated the company name and asked how I may help. He hangs up. The third time around, he asks if this is Jill on the phone, and I ask to whom am I speaking. He hangs up again. The next time he calls, he's breathing hard on the phone and tells me he wants me to talk to him, and he's not going to hurt me. I jot down his phone number and I start hanging up whenever his call pops up, which was the better part of an hour. This went on for months. When he realized I was hanging up every time I saw that number, he began calling from a restricted number, meaning I never knew if it was a legit call and ended up answering. All the time, this guy keeps saying he wants me to talk to him and that he's not going to hurt me. The one time I counted, I hung up on this guy over 200 times in one night. Every time he would call, I'd say the company name, and as soon as I heard him, I hung up. I complained to my boss and she did nothing. Instead, she laughed the whole thing off because this guy obviously didn't know where I was, and he was only a voice on the line and I was perfectly safe. Some time into this, I started talking to coworkers, and here's where it started getting really creepy. He never called on my days off, when someone else would be covering my shift. Indeed, at one point I changed shifts with a coworker to attend a wedding, and he didn't call that day. As time went by, I was getting pretty spooked by the whole situation, and the fact my boss did zero to try to stop this. My coworkers were sympathetic, and told me that if my boss did nothing, I should file a complaint myself, but I'm not sure I could, since this wasn't happening on my personal number. None of them could really walk me at home, since I was the only operator on the night shift. Everyone else was gone by the time my boss arrived and I left the office. I got a little paranoid, because obviously this guy knew my schedule pretty well, and even if I changed shifts, he would only call if he knew I was on the line. It had to be someone who could see me. I started doing commute with my cell phone in hand at all times, with the emergency number dialed in. Sometimes I did the whole commute on the phone with friends or relatives to keep calm. Since it's illegal to carry pepper spray here, at one point I considered walking around with a box cutter in my purse. That's how afraid I was. One day before my shift started, I was at the entrance of the building smoking a cigarette before going up, and I see the security guy come by. Same fellow who usually did the overnight shift. This huge guy. I didn't really know him, never spoke much to him, only said good evening or goodbye when I went to his desk, and whenever he came to my floor to do his rounds. I usually kept to myself, and never really made small talk or anything, just greeted him out of politeness, and he greeted back. He asked for a light, so I gave him my lighter, and he told me he'd been fired, and he was going home. And he went on to tell me that he always got the impression I was afraid of him, since I was never really friendly or welcoming. Those were his exact words. Then he told me he was never going to hurt me, and just walked away. I lost every drop of blood I had in me. I went inside to tell my boss the whole thing, and discovered the guy got fired for harassing women on other floors, going as far as trying to corner someone in one of the elevators. The complaints piled up and he lost his job. Most of the time, his shifts matched mine, so he would see me come in at 8 p.m. and left before I did. I asked my boss for that phone number again, to come forward on this guy. Asked the security company if that was his number. She told me she threw it away. When I told her the whole story, she found it cute, exact word. Then, she asked me if I was sure that it was him, because a voice on the phone is different, and maybe you got it wrong. Her exact words. Quality assurance told us time and time again that every call was recorded, so I demanded the recordings. This is when I found out that, again, because of budget cuts and whatnot, the night shift was never recorded, so I had no evidence. Once the guy was fired and the calls stopped, I didn't work there for much longer after that. So yeah, I have this guy's face imprinted in my mind.